Hey everybody, happy Wednesday. How we doing? Doing good? Did everybody see the Biden and Kamala Harris speech today? Hope so. It was pretty good. Do have to say I am quite excited. Get pumped. Get pumped. Sorry, it's been a long week. Anyway, so on to reading the last 10 minutes of chapter 9. If you are wondering, we've got, according to this, 51% of the book read. But at 130, so we've only got about 70 pages left, and the rest of this is acknowledgments and about the author and an epilogue that we may or may not read, because honestly, like, I can't imagine she's going to lend any influence. 6 pages maybe, I don't know. Push comes to shove. I mean, we're coming up on roughly, I'd have to say probably 70% of this bad boy's behind us. But anyway, enough of me rambling on about all sorts of nonsense. Let's get to reading, shall we? So, chapter 9, still reading. Why am I having problems? Still reading The Art of the Bailout, part 3. From time to time, Donald asked about my mother. He hadn't seen her in 4 years, ever since Ivana and Blaine had given Gam an ultimatum just before Thanksgiving. Either Linda come to the house for the holidays, or they didn't. They found their not exactly sister-in-law too quiet and depressed, and they just couldn't have a good time with her there. My mother had been in the Trump family since 1961, and though I never understood why my grandfather required her presence at holidays after my parents divorced, she always went. More than 25 years later, my grandmother chose Ivana and Blaine, without factoring in how the decision might affect me and my brother. Now, Donald said, I think we made a big mistake continuing to support your mother. It might have been better off if we cut her off a couple of years and she had to stand on her own 2 feet. The idea that anyone else was entitled to money or support he or she wasn't obviously earning was impossible for Donald and my grandfather to fathom. Nothing my mother had received as the former wife of the oldest son of a very wealthy family who had raised 2 of Fred and Mary Trump's grandchildren almost single-handedly had come from my grandfather, and it certainly hadn't come from Donald, yet they both acted as if it did. Donald probably thought he was being kind. There used to be a spark of that in him. He did once give me $100 to get my car out of an impound, and after my grandfather died, Donald was the only member of the family other than my grandmother who included me in anything. But his kindness had become so warped over time, through lack of use and Fred's discouragement. That's what he considered kindness would have been practically unrecognizable to the rest of us. I didn't know it at the time, but when we had that conversation, Donald was still receiving his $450,000 allowance from the banks every month. I mean, this is back in what, the 80s? Maybe early 90s? $450,000? That's good money now. A month. Give me a break. Continuing on. One morning, as I sat across from Donald at his desk, going over the details of our trips to MarALago, Donald thought it would help me with the book if I saw his Palm Beach mansion firsthand. The phone rang. It was Philip Johnson. As they chatted, Donald suddenly seemed to get an idea. He put the phone on speaker. "Philip," he said, "you have to talk to my niece. She's writing my next book. You can call her about the Taj." I introduced myself, and Philip suggested I come to his house in Connecticut the following week to discuss the book. After Donald ended the call, he said to me, "That'll be fantastic. Philip is a great guy. I hired him to design the portico-share for the Taj Mahal." Portico-share. These are all dashed. Porta, P-O-R-T-A dash co-share for the Taj Mahal. It's tremendous. I'd never seen anything like it. What the fuck is a porte-cochere? That just doesn't... A shared door? A giant hole that, because it's a hole, has two sides? I'm at a loss. I'm sorry. After we finished discussing the logistics to our trip to Florida, I left the office and headed to the library. I had no idea who Philip Johnson was, and I'd never heard of a porte-cochere. Ha ha ha. 1 page later. In the limo on the way to the airport the following day, I told Donald that I'd arranged to meet Johnson at our home, which I'd learned at the library was the very famous glass house that he, a very famous architect, had designed. I had also discovered that the thing Johnson had designed for the Taj, what Donald called a porte-cochere, was a porte-cochere, basically a large carport. I understood why Donald had wanted Johnson to be involved in the project. He wasn't just famous. He had traveled in the kind of circles Donald aspired to. I didn't, however, understand why Johnson would bother designing the Taj's carport. It was a very small-scale project that seemed not worth his while. I mean, it's a fucking carport, right? Like the giant, stupid overhang in front of a hotel door. It's a carport. What? When Donald picked up a copy of the New York Post less than 10 minutes into the car ride, I knew he had no intention of giving me information for the book. I'd begun to suspect that he'd hired me without consulting his publisher because he didn't want to be micromanaged by the people there. It would also be a lot easier to put off his niece, who wasn't under contract and was barely getting paid, than a professional writer who would most likely have a significant stake in the success of the book. But we were about to be trapped together on a plane for 2 hours, so I hoped he might talk to me then. When we got into the cabin of the jet that was waiting for us on the tarmac, Donald spread out his arms and asked, "What do you think?" "It's great, Donald." I knew the drill. As soon as we reached cruising altitude and we could unbuckle our seatbelts, one of his bodyguards handed him a huge stack of mail after setting a glass of Diet Coke next to him. I watched as he opened one envelope after another, then, after examining the contents for a few seconds, threw them and the envelope on the floor. When a large pile accumulated, the same guy would reappear, pick up the waste paper, and throw it into the garbage. That happened over and over again. I moved to another seat so I didn't have to watch. I mean, no joke. No fucking joke. What? My 4-year-old knows how to use a trash bin. Just another way in which my son would make a better fucking president at 4 than the current asshole in chief. I mean 45. I'm sorry. Have to stay respectful, right? The staff were waiting as the large car pulled up to the entrance at MarALago. Donald went off with his butler, and I introduced myself to everybody else. The 58-bedroom mansion with 33 bathrooms outfitted with fixtures plated in gold and an 1,800-square-foot living room that sported 42-foot ceilings was as garish and uncomfortable as I'd expected. Dinner that evening was just me, Donald, and Marla. Oh, that's right. Ivana is no longer in the picture. He's now married to Marla Maples. I forgot about that. Okay. Get that in there. She and I had met a few times before, but we had never had a chance to get to know each other one-on-one. I found her friendly, and Donald seemed relaxed with her. She was just 2 years older than I was, and about as different from Ivana as a human being could be. Marla was down-to-earth and soft-spoken, where Ivana was all flash, arrogance, and spite. The next day, I spent the morning exploring the property. There was no other guests, so the entire place felt empty and strangely quiet. I talked to the butler to see if he had any interesting stories, got to know some of the other guys who worked there, and then took a quick swim before lunch, which was scheduled for 1 p.m. As formal as MarALago was in some ways, it was also much more casual than our usual family gathering places, so I felt comfortable wearing a bathing suit and a pair of shorts to lunch, which was being served on the patio. Donald, who was wearing golf clothes, looked up at me as I approached as if he'd never really seen me before. "Holy shit, Mary, you're stacked." Donald, Marla said in mock horror, slapping him lightly on the arm. I was 29 and not easily embarrassed, but my face reddened, and I suddenly felt self-conscious. Because your uncle just commented on your boobs. I pulled my towel around my shoulders. It occurred to me that nobody in my family outside of my parents and brother had ever seen me in a bathing suit. Unfortunately for the book, that was about the only interesting thing that happened during my entire visit to Palm Beach. Back in New York, Donald finally got sick of my asking him to sit down for an interview and handed me a list of names. Talk to these people. Included were the presidents of his casinos and Mary Ann's husband, John. Although that was potentially helpful, he didn't seem to understand that writing the book without any input from him would be close to impossible. I met with all the presidents of the casinos. Not surprisingly, a lot of their answers were canned, and I realized that they weren't going to give me dirt on what was happening in their boss's business at the height of the casino's chaos and dysfunction. The trips weren't a total waste of time. I'd never been down there before, and at least I got a sense of the place. My meeting with John Barry was even less productive than the trips to Atlantic City. "What can you tell me?" I asked him. He rolled his eyes. Finally, Donald told me his editor wanted to meet with me. A lunch was set up, and I arrived at the restaurant thinking he and I were going to be discussing next steps. It was an expensive inn place in Midtown, and we were seated at a small, cramped table near the kitchen. With very little preliminary conversation, the editor told me that Random House wanted Donald to hire someone with more experience. "I've been working on this for a while," I said, "and I think I've made some progress. The problem is I can't get Donald to sit down with me for an interview." "You can't expect to play a Mozart concerto the first time you sit down at a piano," the editor said, as if I'd just learned the alphabet the day before. "Donald told me he likes what I've done so far." The editor looked at me as if I'd just proved his point for him. "Donald hasn't read any of it," he said. I stopped at the office the next day to clear out my desk and hand over anything that might be useful to my eventual replacement. I wasn't upset. I didn't even mind that Donald had had somebody else fire me. The project had hit a wall. Besides, after all of the time I spent in his office, I still had no idea what he actually did.